To that end, today we're going to be talking about moral nihilism. In order to set this up, I think it might be helpful to kind of do a brief recap of some of the theories that we've looked at so far. So what was the first theory that we looked at? Who was the first philosopher we read in this unit? Ethical theory-wise, not way back at the beginning. Kant, right. And what did Kant say about what makes an action moral or immoral? What for him matters when we're trying to determine if an action is moral or immoral?
You needed reason behind it?
Right. It's informed by our reasoning capacities. In layman's terms, I've been describing it as it's the intention behind the action. Right? It's the intention behind the action that determines whether it's moral or immoral. If you had a good intention, then you did a good thing, even if you didn't achieve your end. Right? We said that the firefighter still does a good thing when he tries to rush into the burning building to save the little girl, even if he doesn't succeed. Right? In more technical terms, we said that the morality of an action for Kant depends on two things. It's whether or not that action was done from duty, just out of pure respect for what's right, that we can access through our rationality. And it depends on whether or not the principle or the maxim or the rule behind our action is universalizable. Right? We applied that universalizability test to see if things like buying shorts every Wednesday at the school store is moral. And we determined, no, there are practical problems with that. But then maxims can also fail logically, right? Because they're self-defeating, like lying, for example, or cashing a bad check. Then we looked at utilitarianism, which is a much different view than Kant's. We looked at the philosophy of Mill. What did Mill say makes an action moral or immoral?
The consequences of the action?
Exactly. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory, and so it states that what makes an action moral or immoral is the consequences. Did the action produce net good or did it produce net suffering? Mill cashed this out in terms of happiness, which includes both higher and lower pleasures. Whether or not the action produces sensuous pleasure in individuals and the higher pleasures, like satisfaction or fulfillment or something like that. It was a consequentialist view. Then we looked at Aristotle. Can somebody summarize what Aristotle thinks about this issue? He took a kind of a different approach, right? He wasn't so much interested in determining what makes an action moral or immoral as what? What was he focused on?
How to make the person moral?
Right. Yeah. How to become a moral person. And we saw in his theory of virtue ethics, or virtue theory, that what's important is not just knowing what the right thing to do is, but habituating yourself, developing a certain character that's going to allow you to just do the moral action naturally when it comes up. That took a different approach on this question of ethics. Finally, we looked at the ethics of care, right? For the ethics of care, what governs the morality of an action? What should we be focusing on in our lives? Yeah.
Strengthening our relationships.
That's right. Yeah. Remember, the ethics of care is a feminist ethical theory. It tries to incorporate the experiences of women throughout history that the feminists who came up with it, Held and Noddings, think haven't been considered enough in philosophy. And it's about strengthening our relationships with people, showing up for those relationships that we're in, actually listening to the other person, trying to connect with them through love and empathy, cultivating those kinds of relationships, and showing up for the people that we're responsible for. We looked at Nietzsche also, but of course his ethical theory is kind of a little bit different than the other ones. He took what we might regard as a more egotistical approach, right? All of this talk about trying to adhere to some morality is holding us back. You need to do what's good for you, right? What's going to further your self-interest and your ends. You need to become strong. And if you need to stomp on a few people to get where you want to go, sucks for them. Today we're going to be looking at a view that's kind of similar to Nietzsche's view, although it's going to deny altogether that there is an objective standard or there's an objective right and wrong. This view is known as moral nihilism. And so most of the views that we've been looking at so far, besides Nietzsche, have been arguing that there is an objective standard of right and wrong, whether that's cashed out in, if the maxim is universalizable, or if it's the consequences, or if it contributes to the development of your own virtue, like Aristotle said. We've been looking at views primarily that have been arguing there is a fact of the matter about what is moral and immoral. They've just been disagreeing about what that fact is. Moral nihilism is going to deny that there is such a fact of the matter. It's going to say, no, there is no fact of the matter about what is moral or immoral. And some moral nihilists are going to say that when we make moral statements like, you ought to do this, you shouldn't lie to your brother, we're not even making statements that are true or false, because they don't reference anything in reality. In order for there to be a fact of the matter about what is right and what is wrong, the moral realists, like these thinkers we've been looking at, cash it out in different terms, but they think that there are these standards or these values that objectively determine what's moral and immoral. The moral nihilist is going to say, well, what the heck are even those things? What does an objective standard look like? It's certainly not the same kind of thing as a table or a chair. How could that thing exist? Where could we even discover that? Bless you. And so we're going to be looking at a view today that takes a very radical position on this whole question of ethics. So just to summarize, so far we've been looking at ethical theories that claim there is a universal, objective moral good. That there is a fact of the matter about what is right to do and what is wrong to do in certain situations. And that this fact, what is objectively good and objectively wrong, is universal. It holds for all people at all times. It doesn't matter what culture you're a part of. Torturing a baby for fun is going to be wrong in Malaysia, just as it's going to be wrong here. It'll be wrong in 2300 as it was in 1850. The thinkers we've looked at previously have argued that such a standard or such an objective morality exists that ought to be sought and acted out. Another way of putting this is a fact of the matter about what's right and good. What one ought to do. But this position is not the only position that's held in moral philosophy. There are those who think that there are no moral facts. There's not a fact of the matter about what's right or wrong. That there's not an objective standard of right and wrong that we should all be appealing to. Or that moral statements, claims about morality, don't have a truth value. They're not true or false because they don't reference anything that actually exists, namely moral facts. This position is known as moral nihilism. One example of moral nihilism is J.L. Mackey's error theory. I'll explain what that is here in a second. It was mentioned in the article I had you read for today. J.L. Mackey developed this view of morality known as error theory, which basically argues that when we're saying moral things, when we're making moral claims, we're committing an error. And what he means by that is we're talking about something that doesn't actually exist. We presume that there's an objective standard of right or wrong. We presume there's a moral fact of the matter, but really those things don't exist. In the original work in which he developed this theory, he called moral facts, or the possible existence of moral facts, queer, which is a little outdated today. But what he meant by that is, if these things were to exist, an objective standard of right and wrong, a moral fact of the matter about what one ought to do, they would be very strange things. As I alluded to before, a moral fact doesn't seem to be the same kind of thing as a water bottle or a laptop or a human body, something that exists in space-time, something that is tangible, that has material properties. Moral facts seem to be something different. And he doesn't think they exist. We can't touch them. We can't see them. We disagree about what's moral or immoral. It's more likely than not that all this talk about morality has to do with something like just our tastes or preferences or our emotions, or it's a product of evolution. The idea that we're grasping onto and all aware of some moral fact that exists outside of us in a different realm than space-time seems nonsensical to Mackey. And so he thinks there's just not an objective standard of right and wrong that holds for all people. There is not a moral fact of the matter about what one ought to do in a certain situation. In this piece, Krellenstein is going to argue for the position of moral nihilism, but his analysis kind of takes on a more holistic scope. What he's going to be doing in this article is he's going to be saying that this view has not been refuted. Moral nihilism has not been refuted. And the idea that there is an objective standard of right and wrong, what we might call moral realism, has not been proven. And he's going to try to draw out some implications of maybe how we should think or how we should live if moral nihilism is true. Bless you. This word says unproven here if you can't see. Moral realism remains unproven. Does anybody have any questions so far about the kind of position that he's going to be taking here? Anybody have any questions about moral nihilism, what it says? Or do you kind of understand what the position is getting at? It's similar to the idea of moral relativism, which is the idea that morality is just relative to the culture or society that you live in, that what one ought to do is going to vary based on where you live, what community you live in, what the rules of that community are, and so on. Both of these views are similar because they both deny that there's an objective standard that we ought to appeal to and that we all ought to act out in the world. Does that make sense? Okay, well, let's jump into the piece then. Krellenstein begins his analysis by discussing some of the experiences, some of the thoughts, and some of the facts of life that support this view. It's not a crazy view, he thinks. We actually have some evidence for this view being true, even if we don't want to admit it or not. For starters, as I just alluded to, you will not find any two cultures that agree on morality. At least not totally, right? I don't think there are any two people in this room who completely agree about what the fact of the matter is about what one ought to do in a certain situation. At least not in every situation. The fact that such disagreement exists provides support for the view that there really isn't this objective standard of right and wrong that exists outside of us, that exists independently of humans, or that humans ought to all appeal to or all follow. So this is one piece of evidence in support of the view. Several facts of life, he says, supports the moral nihilist position. The first of these is that there are no moral foundations or ethical theories that everyone accepts and acts out. And we can show this quite clearly. Anybody here think Kant's view is maybe the best view that we've looked at so far? It's the intention behind the action, right? Anybody like that view? Yeah? All right, does anybody think utilitarianism is the right one? It's the right ethical theory. I bet there's at least one person in here who's a utilitarian. See, there's already disagreement. We can't even agree on what makes an action moral or immoral, ultimately. And what's more than that is, we all certainly act differently in life, right? We don't have the same values. We don't follow the same rules. There is not one standard that we all accept and act out. Furthermore, there has been no conclusive argument demonstrating that we ought to adopt one fundamental value or one fundamental theory over any other. When we're talking about morality, when we're talking about the values that we have, we seem to be talking about foundational beliefs. Things that we just accept. Things that are integral to our identity, or things that are integral to the way that we see the world. But there has been no conclusive argument for adopting any of these ethical theories or any of the values that we espouse, right? Let's say you value social justice. You value it to your core, you act it out, you're trying to live by it, you're trying to see social justice established. That is a fundamental value that you hold. How could I convince you that some other value should take that value's place? What if I said, no, loyalty is the value that you should adhere to? That should be your highest value. What kind of argument can I give for that? I could develop one. But when we're talking about foundational beliefs, when we're talking about foundational values, these are things that we just kind of accept and we don't question. And we're unmoved by the fact that other people have different fundamental values than ours. When you're discussing a fundamental value with someone who has a different one than you just end up butting heads, right? Insofar as our values, insofar as the ethical theory that we think is right, is tied to these foundational beliefs that are integral to who we are, there isn't really any rational argument that we can come up with that can conclusively show why one foundational value is better than another. Although we might have certain intuitions about that, right? Because we obviously don't share the same values. Another reason why we might think that the moral nihilism position is more tenable than any other is because there has been a lot of psychological evidence that has been coming out since the late 1800s that evolution seems to be the origin of our morality. The reason that we have the moral beliefs that we do, the reason that we follow the systems of morality that we do, is because primarily they are evolutionary adaptations to living in human societies that confer certain benefits to us. If this is true, if evolution really did produce in us our moral attitudes, our moral beliefs, our values, then our morality is just a product of nature like anything else, right? Like a bug, like a tree, like our own ape bodies, if you follow this view. If evolution is the origin of morality, then that casts doubt on the claim that there is some sort of objective standard that exists independently of us, right? All our views, all our attitudes about morality is just a product of some sort of evolutionary process. It could have gone a different way. We could have developed a different morality, depending on the environment in which we were in, if we were in a different environment. And there's a more basic claim that's associated with this piece of evidence. And that is what the philosopher David Hume has written about extensively in his philosophy. He says, you cannot derive an ought from an is. And what he means by that is you cannot derive an objective standard of right and wrong simply from a description of how the universe is. I can tell you anything there is to know about the universe scientifically, descriptively. There's a table at this location. The electrons in my body are moving in this way. I have fingernails. These are all descriptions of reality. But you cannot derive what you ought to do in the future just from descriptions of reality. And if it's true that really our reality is just natural, if there are no supernatural things that exist, if our reality is materialistic, if everything is just atoms and molecules and energy and waves, then it seems difficult to not only provide a basis for some objective standard or right and wrong, it also becomes difficult to know how we would even access that if such an objective standard exists. Finally, Krellenstein argues that moral realism, the idea that there's a fact of the matter about what's right and what's wrong, is an odd, hard to defend theory. For the reasons that we've been mentioning up until this point. When you see an immoral situation happening in front of your eyes, what tells you that it's an immoral situation? It's certainly not anything about the objects or the subjects involved in the situation, right? In one context, a cat on fire is not an immoral thing, but in another context it might be. But nothing about the cat, nothing about the fire, nothing about the heat, nothing about the arrangement of atoms is going to tell you that it's moral or immoral. So the first question is, well, how do we determine what's moral or immoral? How do we access the objective standard of right and wrong, if such a thing exists? How could we know what it is? And then another problem is, well, if there is such an objective standard, if there are moral facts, to quote Mackey, they would have a queer kind of existence. They would be very weird things. What does a moral fact look like? We can't touch it. We can't see it. We can't taste it. We can't experiment with it, right? We can't measure a moral fact using an oscilloscope or something like that. So they would have to be very strange entities if they did exist. Entities that we can't really describe or really conceive of. And then for the reasons just mentioned, the fact that there's moral disagreement across the board, the fact that ultimately that it seems the values we have are foundational and they're just things that we decide not to budge on, that we can't develop a rational argument for why we have the values that we do. All of this kind of leads to a situation in which this idea that there is a fact of the matter about what's right and wrong is not a very defensible view. It doesn't seem like the evidence points in that direction, Krellenstein argues. How do you all feel about this view? Is this a view that you accept? Is this a view that you've thought about? Do you like it? Does it disturb you? What do you all think? Yeah.
Like, I get what he's saying, but at the same time he's like, well, you can't touch morality, so it's not real. Well, you can't touch knowledge either.
It's true. Yeah. Do you think that refutes his position?
I don't know.
I don't know either. Is anybody disturbed by this view? There's no fact of the matter about what's moral or immoral. Some people have thought that when we're making moral claims, what we're just doing is we're just expressing our own emotions. We're just saying, when we're saying murder is bad, we're saying, ew, murder, or something like that. David Hume, thought that our morality is just a matter of taste. We just have different tastes and preferences for what's moral or immoral. There's no objective standard. It's just some people like murder and some people don't like murder. Some people like lying, some people don't like lying. They have a taste for that, they don't have a taste for this. What would this view imply if it was true?
That nothing really matters.
You think so?
Yeah, it seems kind
At
of
least
like
in the moral realm,
yeah.
maybe. Would we think it was acceptable to judge other people's actions if we held this view? What do y'all think? If there's an objective standard of morality, then obviously it seems like it's justifiable to judge people for what they do because it's not in line with that thing, right? But can we defend our own judgments of other people? Can we defend our own critiques of other people's actions if we hold to this view? Yeah.
No, because you're ultimately judging their morals, but if there isn't an objective morality, then you can't really judge that because it doesn't exist.
Right. At least in some sense, it would be like saying, you lied to your sister? That's terrible. But what you're really saying is, I don't like that you lied to your sister. But what if they like lying to their sister? You know? What's the problem then? I do think, even on this view, we could devise some sort of rationale for still judging people's actions. But it certainly wouldn't be the strongest position to judge from, right? At least not the strong position that's afforded us by believing in an objective standard of morality. We might think this view is rather disturbing, that it implies some heinous things or some dangerous things about how we ought to orient our own lives and how we might act in society. But Krellenstein doesn't see it that way. He sees adopting this view as possibly liberating. Actually, he has good things to say about this. How could this view be liberating? Why might adopting this view actually be a good idea? Anybody have a guess? Why might he look favorably upon this view?
Just because objective morality is so abstract and it's hard to define, it's kind of easier to accept that it doesn't exist because you kind of have more evidence that it doesn't exist than it does.
Okay. So maybe moral realism is too hard to defend. Maybe we're wasting a lot of time and energy trying to convince people of this. You know, maybe we'd save ourselves a lot of time and energy if we stopped arguing about this and we all just accepted, look, there's really no fact of the matter. There's practical reasons to accept the moral nihilist position. What else? How might this be liberating for humanity? Anybody have any ideas? Yeah.
The problem is liberating humanity. Why is that?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Because I think maybe because it just helps people just think freely.
Helps people think freely. Maybe giving up on the idea of an objective standard releases people from the mental shackles that they've been placed in by their religion or their culture. It allows them to be more free, to act freely in life. Freedom's a good thing, right? That could be one way. What would giving up on an objective morality allow us to do? It's related to the idea of freedom.
Like whatever we want without fear of repercussions, because if there's no moral, like objective morality, then you have no right to judge what somebody else does.
Right. Right. Why would that be liberating, though? Yeah.
Because there's no one way for a person to be moral then if there is no return of morals at all.
Could you say more about that?
Like, if there is no determined, like, right or wrong morally, then technically everyone's living by their own morals and therefore living their life.
Living their own life. So maybe they're living more authentically. Maybe they're happier because they're not living by somebody else's morals, right? They feel freer. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, it was something similar to what you said, basically, like, people will live without the fear of judgment from others, so they would do exactly what they thought of doing.
Right? Maybe if we gave up on the idea that there's an objective right and wrong, people wouldn't feel so much shame for their actions. People wouldn't feel so much stigma for their lives. Maybe, we could live more authentic, free existences. In any case, what moral nihilism implies, first and foremost, is that there is no value or set of values that is beyond dispute. And this has a direct bearing on all the things that we just mentioned. The idea that no value or set of values is beyond dispute. Krellenstein argues that giving up on an objective morality could allow us to become more humble, could allow us to more thoroughly enjoy life by not taking ethics so seriously. People are so strongly motivated by morals, they'll kill people, they'll do heinous things. Morality, ethics can sometimes suck the joy out of life, right? How are you going to have fun with your friends, when they want to smoke and all you can hear in the back of your head is your parent saying to you, if you smoke, you're going to lose your mind and it's bad and all these things. Don't take it so seriously, right? Why do you allow your life to be governed by these abstract moral rules that you can't prove that exist, that cause you to have a lot of shame, that cause you to have some pride, right? Pride can often be generated in people who think that they're being very moral, and that causes them to look down on others. Giving up on an objective morality could humble us and allow us to enjoy life more thoroughly. In the social realm, Krellenstein says that a lot of social issues are generated because of our disagreements with morality, because of our disagreements about what we think the ultimate value is, what we ultimately think the right thing to do is. This can cause a lot of social strife, right? If one social group has a set of values and another social group has a different set of values, they're inevitably going to come into conflict, right? But if we just gave up on the idea that there is a fact of the matter about who has the right set of values, that could increase our ability to compromise and live more harmoniously with one another. We can make society better. People can become consumed by their morality, right? Consumed in a way that doesn't actually let them exist in the here and now, that prevents them from really connecting with people, that prevents them from living in the present, from enjoying this life here on earth. If their head is always in the clouds, worrying about morality, worrying about what's right endlessly. In that way, accepting moral nihilism might allow us to live more fuller, meaningful lives, right? We're not stuck endlessly worrying about what's right or what's wrong. We can focus on other things. We can paint, we can do woodworking, we can enjoy nature. Krellenstein sees the moral nihilistic position as one that would actually be good for humanity if we just faced up to the facts and we all accepted. And we stopped arguing endlessly about what the ultimate right thing to do is. We could adopt instead what he calls a good enough set of values that we just agree upon because they're useful to us and they help us live more harmoniously. We would, of course, say that these values aren't objectively the best or objectively right and wrong, but we could accept a set of values that would at least allow us to live together in a way that's going to allow us to flourish, in a way that squabbles over what is ultimately right and wrong won't allow us to do. In this way, you might think that adopting a morally nihilistic position might allow more for the emergence of a multicultural society. Something to think about. Of course, I'm not sure this view is all sunshine and rainbows, though. Does anybody have any problems with this view? If you don't like it, what are your reasons for not liking it?
I think with this view, people could be led to do some like crazy and explicit things.
Like what? Tell me, please give me an example. What's crazy? What shouldn't we be doing? What if I told you all that, I derive a lot of pleasure from torturing woodland animals? I just like to go out in the forest. I like to set little traps for the squirrels and the bunnies, and then I like to skin them alive. I get a lot of pleasure from that. That's fun. Should I do that? Is that good? Do y'all have a problem with that? Why would you have a problem with that? Is that bad? It's messed up. Should we encourage people not to do that? Why don't we just let people kind of do what they want as long as they're not hurting any other person? If y'all don't like this view, what are the problems that you see with it? You had a very strong reaction to that example, right? What about that example rubs you the wrong way? What do you think's going wrong there? We talk about being nice, about being tolerant of other values, about being tolerant of other cultures' way of life. But do we act that way? Should we tolerate the historical Eskimo practice of leaving their children out in the snow to die? Do we have a right to really judge that? What do you think? Perhaps a more interesting question is, can we get away from judging that? Can we think and can we act as if there are no objective morals, as if everything is permitted? What do you think? Yeah.
Can't do that because then people would do things unchecked.
Everything would just dissolve into chaos. And we don't want chaos. We don't want violent chaos. We certainly think and act like there's an objective standard of morality. maybe we can't devise an ultimately rational argument for it or prove it, but if it is an artifact of human existence that we can't do away with, why should we really care about this view? You see what I'm getting at? We can certainly alter our beliefs, we can alter our views of other people, but can we get away with not judging other people's way of life? Can we ever completely tolerate everything that comes our way? Should we do that? It might just be that, psychologically at least, we're stuck with presuming that there's an objective morality. Just like we're stuck with the feeling that we're free. Right? I can give you any scientific argument in the world about why you're just a biological machine, you're just made of atoms and molecules following the laws of nature, and you don't really have any choice in what you do. But you can't escape the feeling that you're free, right? You can't escape the inner experience of thinking as if you have genuine alternatives for action and then choosing one. I think one of the problems, at least from how I see it with this view, is that it doesn't seem like it can be acted out with consistency. How would you have to reorganize your life if you did accept that this is true and you were going to try to follow it? What would you do? If you ascribe to this view, you think that, yeah, there's no objective fact of the matter about what's right or wrong. But then do you organize your life that way? None of us live like that. None of us think like that. No, we have a hierarchy of values. There are some things we value more than others. There are some things that are more important to us. There are some things that we think are good and bad that are on a certain scale. We certainly don't think and act as if none of it is ultimately right or wrong, right? And we certainly don't treat other people as if this is true, right? We judge other people for their actions. We judge other cultures for their practices and their beliefs. I'm not sure that we could live a human life and not think and act in this way, even if we might think it's wrong in some instances to judge. You see what I'm saying? Does anybody agree with this take? Or do you think it's just dead wrong? I'm dead wrong here. One of the things that is really important to do when you're thinking about these issues and you're thinking about your beliefs generally is you want there to be a mapping, to speak in mathematical terms, between your beliefs and between how you act. You want to act in a way that is in line with your beliefs. You want to be consistent. I don't think this is going to allow for a consistent mode of being that is consistent with what this belief is. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, though. How about this? Krellenstein thinks that giving up on the idea of an objective morality is actually liberating. Does anybody think that might actually produce anxiety and bad consequences? happen if everyone in the U.S. all of a sudden believed this right now? What would happen to our society? Do you think good would come of it, or do you think bad would come of it? Would we suddenly establish an anarchist utopia? Or would our society fall into violent chaos, like Hobbes would say, if we didn't have a government or police? Yeah. You think it would be violent chaos? Why do you have such a pessimistic view of human nature? That was sarcastic, obviously. Is it pessimistic or is it realistic?
Realistic.
You think it's realistic? Why?
Because I feel like humans are just fairly selfish and aggressive creatures.
Okay.
So we're gonna act out like animals if we can do whatever we want.
Okay. Anybody agree with that? Yeah?
You said realistic. You said realistic?
Realistic, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Because have you ever heard of like there was some artist and she like put herself up for like 48 hours with anyone to do anything to her. And then at first they started just like drawing on her. And then after a while they just started like doing some more harsh things to her. Have you ever heard of that?
No. That's a bold move.
Yeah.
I wouldn't let anybody do anything to me for 48 hours. Maybe the widespread acceptance of this view would produce bad consequences socially. But maybe it might produce anxiety in us. Does anybody feel like they might have an existential crisis if they actually came to believe there is nothing ultimately right or wrong? You have to rethink your entire life, right? Why did you make the decisions that you did? You probably have so many regrets. You've been like, I could have lied to Jamie in the 8th grade and taken her boyfriend, but I didn't. And now I wish I would have been with James. Like, I don't know, whatever it is. It might produce anxiety in us. I don't know. It depends on how you look at it, though, right? Maybe you do view this as liberating, if you were to accept it and if others were to accept it. Generally, although we cannot prove moral realism, although we cannot prove definitively that some objective standard of morality exists, it just doesn't seem that this view is right. It seems hard to accept. This is obviously not very much of a critique, but I think most of us have that intuition, though. It just doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't seem to be the case that there isn't a fact of the matter about what's right and wrong. We certainly don't think and act that way, as we've been discussing. But, I don't know, maybe that depends on your perspective too. What kind of consequences might follow if we did accept this position? What other consequences? Would it change how you treat other people? Yeah? How would you start treating other people?
Oh, not me personally.
Oh, okay. But like rationally, it might.
If someone were to accept it, they would find like they wouldn't be as respectful to like strangers as they normally would under how we think now.
When I start thinking about this puzzle, what crosses my mind is I can respect somebody making an argument that some other value should be my top priority. or I should be operating by some other objective standard than I am right now. That has some force for me. But if someone were to come up to me like a moral nihilist and say, there is no ultimate right or wrong, what kind of force would that argument have for you? Like, if someone's saying, yeah, I think morality is just subjective. I don't think there's an ultimate right or wrong. I think it's relative to each person. It's basic whatever they want. Why should anybody listen to what that person has to say? They've just admitted that they're operating and they're arguing by their own tastes and preferences, right? It would be like me saying, well, I think macaroni and cheese is the best food. You should too. Right? As soon as you deny that there's an objective standard and you descend to the idea that there's a subjective standard, at least for me, that takes away some force of your argument. It's like, well, why should I listen to anything subjective you have to say? It's just a product of your tastes and your preferences. Like, that doesn't have real force or validity to me like a rational argument would. Which a rational argument is something that's objectively rational, right? It follows objective laws of logic that we've all agreed to, that we all presuppose. So at least for me, when I think about this argument, that's what pops into my head. I think, well, you're just arguing on the basis of your tastes and preferences. Why should I care about your tastes or preferences at all? I don't have those tastes or preferences. Maybe that's going too far into it, though. I don't know. In any case, I'm not trying to convince you that this view is wrong, but I am trying to expand your horizons. I am trying to give you alternate perspectives, ways of viewing these different theories that we've been looking at. It's primarily my goal in this class, is not to present to you what I think is necessarily a correct, objective picture of reality, but to give you food for thought, to introduce you to alternative perspectives. It's going to be up to you to decide what you believe in and what you're going to act out at the end of the day. Individually, you all have to do that. Does anybody else have any comments on this view? Anything they want to say? Anything that they're questioning, wondering about? You all completely understand it? Don't have any opinions? Yes?
What were you saying about it leading to an existential crisis? Like accepting moral nihilism would?
Yeah, well, let's just go through the thought experiment. Let's say you wake up tomorrow and you believe that there is no objective right and wrong. That would cast all of your previous experiences in a different light, right? That would cause you to rethink many different instances and experiences in your life. It would cause you to rethink how you probably should act in the future, how we should organize society. It really would be like, it would have ramifications for your entire worldview, I think. Because the way that we think and act is so strongly connected to the ideas of should and ought and morality that it might just cause you to fall into a pit of despair if you're not lucky. Nothing means anything, right? There's no objectively moral or objectively immoral action. There's just pain and suffering everywhere in the world. And it's not right or wrong, right? How minorities are treated isn't right or wrong, ultimately. But that seems hard to reconcile with, the values that you had before. Yeah.
Not that, I agree with this or would live by this. I is it really objective? Like, is it something in us, or is it something that we grew up with, like, ingrained in us, the morals of, like, what's supposed to be right and wrong? Like, if we grew up with something different, like, if someone told us killing people is right, then would we believe that as to be right?
That's a great question. That's one that's been debated in philosophy since its inception. Yeah, where do our morals come from? Are they just ingrained in us by our society and our culture and our upbringing? If we lived in a different society or culture, would we have different values? Almost certainly, right? But then a question you have to ask yourself is, does that mean there isn't a right answer about what to do in a situation? A moral fact of the matter? It's a hard question to answer. We certainly act like there is a fact of the matter. We think like there's a fact of the matter. It's a very hard question. Another question you might want to ask yourself is, well, how different really are cultures from each other, morally speaking? Sure, some cultures engage in female genital mutilation. Sure, some cultures engage in human sacrifice. But what are those practices ultimately motivated by? It might be the case that we share the same underlying values, but they just take on different forms depending on the culture. In Japanese culture, for instance, honoring one's family is very important. I think that's a value that we all share, but it takes on a different form in American society. We don't bow, to our ancestors when we meet them, or our uncles or aunts or anything. But we both value honor as a virtue and honoring our family, it seems. Or let's take a more extreme example, like the one I mentioned previously, how some Eskimo families, if they don't feel like they have enough food to support the new baby they had, they'll leave their baby out in the snow to die. So it's not a drain on the family resources, so the family can survive. Self-preservation is a value that we all share, right? Wanting to protect our families, make sure that our families have resources, that's a value that we all share, right? But it takes on a different form depending on the culture. So I think a good argument could be made that most, if not all, cultures share the same basic underlying values, but how we interpret the way those values ought to be carried out differs. Does anybody think that view is right or that view is wrong? I don't know if I believe that, but it makes some sense. In any case, we are basically now finished up with this unit. I've given you a bunch of different ethical theories, a bunch of different ways of explaining what makes an action moral or immoral. We looked at a view about, well, how do we become moral people? How do we develop good moral characters? Next week, we are going to take a more practical turn, a more concrete turn. We're not going to be talking so much about this abstract stuff. We're actually going to be talking about ethical issues. Ethical issues, moral dilemmas that face us. And we're going to be trying to apply these theories to see how they would make sense of that situation. What these views would say, what the moral action is to do in the situation. Before that, we have a discussion day, I believe, on Tuesday. So come with any questions that you have about anything related to these views or these thinkers or these concepts that we've been looking at in this unit. We'll go through those first. And then if you don't have any specific questions, we'll just have general philosophical chats. Sound good? Okay. All right. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Thanks for coming.